All right, folks, it is exactly 9 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, if you're just joining, if you would please just go ahead and mute your mics to avoid any feedback. We'd appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jen Wade. I'm the Grants Division Director over at OPB. I also have Jonna West, who's going to be your point of contact from the OPB side for this Capital Project Fund grant program. And obviously Jessica Simmons. Hi, Jessica. She's on as well. We are recording this. Hey, Josh Hildebrandt as well from GTA. We are recording this and we will post it on our website for the Capital Projects Fund after this website or the webinar has concluded. So it'll be available for you guys to refer back to as well. As you all know, on Friday, the governor announced the capital project funds and the subsequent information on the grant program and the application process. That includes the verification process. GTA is partnering with OPB on this, and so we are going to let Jessica take it away to give you all the information that you need on the verification process and the grant program. So take it away, Jessica.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We want this to hopefully be a good information session. We are going to go through a few points that were in the notice of funding opportunity, and then would love to open it up for your questions. Just want this to be a collaborative session. So with that, let me share my screen. And let's make sure can everybody see the PowerPoint? Can everybody see my screen?
Yes. Yes, ma'am. We're good.
Yes. Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you so much for being with us this morning for our run through of the capital projects grant program. One thing that we wanted to first discuss is that the state for this grant program has selected the eligible project areas based on the most unserved counties within our state. That's most unserved from both a percentage basis, but then also just a sheer numbers basis of unserved locations within a county. And so here we're displaying the list of preliminary eligible project areas. Here you can see obviously the list of counties to your left and a map of those project areas on your right. It is possible that there might be some unserved locations within the county that are not part of the eligible project area, but the state has determined the eligible project areas working with an engineering firm, and so we will be accepting applications to propose service to all locations within the selected eligible project areas. One thing to note, we have received some questions about this. If a county is not listed here or it's not listed on our map, it is not eligible for the capital projects grant program. Again, these locations were selected based on the most unserved based on the state broadband map. However, we are also currently working through our service verification process that I'll describe in a moment. And so what that is potentially doing is to make sure that if there are any providers that have since built 2 locations that have not been included in our mapping effort, or if there are providers that are not participating in the mapping effort, that we can accurately map where locations are already served, because the goal for this program is to provide service to unserved locations. And so with that, and so with that, just again, the overall details, a lot of this again is contained within the notice of funding opportunity, but approximately $240 million is going to be available for the capital projects grant program. Obviously, the state has received additional funding. It's ultimately $259 million for our state's capital projects allotment. However, ultimately, hey, good morning. If anybody just joined, if you could go on mute, that would be wonderful. And so essentially what we're doing is a portion of the funding can be used for administrative costs of to administer the program, mainly kind of our reporting and compliance on the back end. And so that's what really makes up for the difference between the 259 million and the 240 million. Again, as we just reviewed, there's currently 44 eligible project areas based on the state's preliminary data. However, the final project areas will be announced prior to the application window opening in early September based on our service verification process. The service verification process, as we've previously noted, is obviously where a provider has the opportunity to review the data, and if they serve any of those locations based on the state's definition of broadband service, which we'll review in just a moment, they can file a service verification where they can make sure that we as the state know that that location is in fact served. And so that way we can make sure that we're strategically focusing this funding on the areas that are either not currently served or don't have current funding commitments to be served. That's another thing we'd like to point out of, based on the state broadband map, as of July 1, we believe that all of the locations within these eligible project areas are unserved. However, we do constantly have providers submit data to Carl Vinson. And so if anybody has submitted anything after July 1, they will need to take advantage of the service verification process to make sure that we're aware of any locations that have been submitted by a provider, again, after July 1. That being said, again, the service verification process started on Monday when the notice of funding opportunity was made available on OPB's website, and it ends on Friday the 26th at 5 p.m. And so to facilitate this process, obviously, we've put out the list of preliminary eligible project areas, along with publicly putting out a list of census blocks and counties of which the preliminary eligible project locations fall within. Some people are used to the process, but the other thing is the state can provide address level information for the preliminary project areas in the addresses and locations contained within that. But the way that you receive that information is by emailing me, and my contact information is at the end of this presentation, to fill out a sublicense agreement, which is required by our vendor. If you'll execute that sublicense agreement and submit a data request form, then we'll be able to actually provide address level information for the locations that are currently within the preliminary eligible project areas. I would also encourage applicants that are planning to apply not only to take advantage of the census blocks and or the preliminary data, the address level data that the state can provide for the challenge process or the service verification process. But I would also encourage anyone that is planning to apply to go ahead and do their data request so that you can go ahead and see the preliminary data so that you can start forming your application. And then once we finish the service verification process, at that point, we will contact anyone that has received that information with any updates of any locations that might be removed following the service verification. Additionally, this was also outlined in the notice of funding opportunity, but so for eligible applicants, this is a little bit different than the State Fiscal Recovery Fund grant that the state previously conducted for broadband. Eligible applicants for the Capital Projects Fund grant program are going to be those entities that are currently providing broadband service. So obviously internet service providers, which also includes obviously co-ops, electric utilities, so our EMCs, and essentially just any other entity that currently builds or operates broadband networks. So municipal utilities. Essentially, if you are a current broadband service provider, you are eligible to apply. Ultimately, the reason and rationale for this is essentially the eligible applicant is going to be the entity that's going to end up owning the network in the end. Based on our State Fiscal Recovery Fund grant program, that's just been a smoother path to design capital projects of essentially doing the direct award to the entity that's going to end up owning the network. The other thing that we wanted to highlight is this program is obviously based on county boundaries, but we also understand that based on current network footprints, EMC territories, ILEC territories, and various other contributing factors, it's possible that, somebody might want to apply for a portion of a county, but not the full eligible project area. However, all of our applications are going to require, as I mentioned previously, a proposal to go to all of the locations that the state identifies for that particular project area. And so to provide flexibility for applicants on that, we will be allowing partnerships or consortium applications. So essentially where two or more providers could partner to develop the best proposal to serve that all locations within that eligible project area. And certainly happy to answer any questions about that as well. Next, wanted to just quickly walk through our timeline. Again, obviously the notice of funding opportunity and the preliminary eligible project areas along with the service verification opening, that was this past Monday. We currently have our workshop, first workshop here for applicants this morning. And what we're really trying to focus on this morning is really focusing on the data request and the service verification process. We certainly can answer any questions about the actual application process, but obviously the application is not publicly available yet and will not be until early September. And so that's why we're going to be conducting a second virtual applicant workshop on September 8th to walk through any additional questions anybody might have or specific application questions at that point. Applications are due by 5 p.m. on October 7th. And then it's the goal of this program to make preliminary award announcements this fall. However, as is outlined in the notice of funding opportunity and obviously within our timeline here, unlike state fiscal recovery funds, the state actually has to get our capital projects fund grant program approved by United States Treasury. And so we are going to be submitting shortly here our application, which is due in September. And so we're confident that we are going to get quick approval based on our conversations previously with Treasury. However, the final recommendations and award announcements are ultimately subject to the state getting approved by Treasury. We will not make any award announcements until the state's program plan is approved by Treasury. Again, obviously we've discussed it previously, but the main point that we really want to discuss today is the service verification process. If you currently can provide service or you're building out service to locations that is not reflected in the July 1st refresh of the Georgia Broadband Availability Map, we encourage you to file a service verification with address level information of the locations that you are either currently serving or actively building to. Again, it can't just be a future plan to go somewhere. You have to be able to show that you are actively building, because ultimately we want to strategically allocate this funding to projects that would not be feasible if not with additional funding. And again, just to reiterate, our state definition of broadband is 25.3. And so it's the way that we do our mapping effort is if a location can reliably be served by 25.3 or higher, we consider that served. And so if there are any locations that you are currently providing at least 25.3 service at, but it's not reflected in the July 1st refresh of the Georgia Broadband Map, or if you submitted data after July 1st to the state, we need you to file a service verification form and provide us address level information so that we can then review that, because the goal of this is to not fund locations that already have service, but for providers that are not currently participating in our broadband map, or for providers that have built out recently 2 locations, obviously that's not data that the state has. And so certainly happy at the end of this to answer any questions as well regarding the service verification process. Quickly, just obviously this goes more kind of into the application development, but wanted to quickly discuss the scoring details within the notice of funding opportunity as well this morning. The different subsections are very similar to the different different groupings that we had during State Fiscal Recovery Fund. However, we've tried to be very clear here of what is expected in the individual sections here, and obviously the scoring and weighting for these sections. So project design and implementation will obviously include a description and summary of your project, along with the technology that you are proposing to deploy. Based on Treasury preference, there is going to be a preference given to applications that propose to deploy fiber, and along with a project timeline. And so in the way that it's going to be set up in the system, we're going to be using SurveyMonkey Apply. And so the way that it will be set up in the system, it will be very helpful to make sure that you essentially can't move forward if you're missing some of the required attachments, like your timeline for this particular section. The next one will be capabilities and competencies. Same thing that we looked at for State Fiscal Recovery Funds, of essentially the number of years the company's been in business, the history of the company, the staff and expertise and experience. Essentially what the state is looking for here is just to ensure that this is a established, experienced provider that has the ability to perform this project. Performance measures, again, very similar to State Fiscal Recovery Funds. We're essentially wanting to know how you're going to track milestones and report on these projects. Project budget is obviously the heaviest weighted component of this, where there is not a matching fund requirement. However, applications that do have the most significant matches obviously are obviously going to be scored or get additional kind of scoring points by the committee based on, sizable matching funds, either from providers or local governments or combinations of that funding. Also, this is different from State Fiscal Recovery Funds, but we also are going to require budgets to be uploaded on a state-provided budget template in order to provide uniformity, but then also to expedite the post-award process as well with our third-party auditors. The next component, community engagement, is very important. It's very important for all of these projects to really engage the community and really get feedback from the constituents, local governments, elected officials, and residents about, not only the need for connectivity in their communities, but also really talking with them about what affordability looks like for their community as well. If you read the CPF guidance from Treasury, which I encourage everyone to do, that is also an attachment on OPB's website on the capital projects page. Obviously, there's a heavy emphasis on community engagement. And so while providers will be the ones that will be directly applying this time, it's still going to be very important for the state to see that there is community involvement and community support for these projects. Finally, there will be an additional scoring criteria that was been added since State Fiscal Recovery Funds that will be for the Capital Projects Fund grant, an affordable offering. Treasury guidance strongly encourages states to require providers to offer a low-cost option. And with conversations with Treasury, they expect to see that low-cost option would be at a minimum of 120 megabits. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions about the scoring also after this. And then with this, I'm going to go ahead and turn this section over to Jen with OPB, Jen and Jana, just to discuss the 2 CFR 200 uniform guidance requirements for this program.
Thanks, Jana, I can take it. All good. So we do have this listed out on our website for the capital project funds as well, but the 2 CFR policy requirements do apply to the assistance listing, which is the capital projects funds. It's subpart B, so you have general provisions, subpart C, pre-federal award requirements and contents of federal awards, subpart D, post-federal award requirements, E, cost principles, and subpart F, audit requirements. Obviously, all of these are extremely important, but we did want to hit home on the subpart D, which includes your procurement guidelines. So we have a lot of, on our 4 grantees website, we have a lot of documentation that will help you with the procurement requirements surrounding this, but the competitive procurement does apply to these funds. And so subrecipients of the capital projects funds will be required to go through that based on the purchasing thresholds, et cetera, that many of you are familiar with already. As a subrecipient, that means that you guys will have to follow all those 2 CFR requirements, making sure that your competitive procurement is documented, where you do have instances of sole sourcing that you document that. And we also have on our 4 grantees website, which I'll put in the chat as well, under our important documents and guides, we have a kind of a procurement shortlist guide for you, but we also have a sole source justification memo template for you to use as well. And that will help you to kind of go through the justification for sole source and then submit that to OPB2, and we can kind of get you approval on your sole source. We're also still working with our partners RSM on all of our procurement. So if you have any questions as you do get awarded and you are trying to document everything, they are happy to meet with you to kind of go over everything to make sure everything's documented thoroughly. Or if you just have general questions before you apply to make sure that something would fit, then again, we're happy to facilitate a call regarding that as well. There are some requirements that don't apply to this assistance listing. Again, we have those on our Capital Projects Fund webpage at 2 CFR Part 25. And so that one does apply. The ones that do not apply are the 2 CFR 200.204, Notice for Funding Opportunities, 200.205, 200.213, and then more importantly, so the 2 CFR 200.316, it's the federal interest in property purchased or improved. That has been something that we have worked through with Treasury on the state fiscal recovery funds. But they did remove that and exclude that from subpart D. So that way there's no federal interest in the asset, especially since these are going directly to the internet service providers as a subrecipient. So we do want to make sure that you are aware that as a subrecipient, those do apply. Happy to answer any questions. 2 CFR 200 is extremely big. So again, we do have more information and a link to 2 CFR 200 as a whole on our website. The Capital Projects Funds has the exact subparts that are applicable to this assistance listing. So I strongly encourage you to make sure that you go over that and understand those guidelines. In the actual application, Jessica has outlined those again, and you will have to make sure that you understand and agree to those terms before you apply as well.
Great, thank you, Jen. It looks like we have a question. The question is, does the Single Audit Act mean the awarded applicant has to complete the audit process once each year during the performance period?
So single audits, if you receive $750,000 or more in federal funding, you have to do a single audit, and that is typically done per year. And that is, if you receive federal funding from a different source, it's $750,000 or more in federal funding. So if you already undergo a single audit, you can use your single audit for that. You don't have to do it separate for each grant stream that you get that's federal funding. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Well, I was going to say, we've now covered what we wanted to initially address within the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Obviously, there is a lot of other information within the Notice of Funding Opportunity related to, participation in the Georgia Broadband Map, participation in FCC's Affordable Connectivity Program, additional kind of specifications or kind of descriptions of how the state has designed this program. But at this time, we'd love to just open it up for any questions that you may have. And then also at the end of this, we'll make sure that you have our contact information so that if there's any questions you'd prefer to address offline, we certainly want to be an available resource to you.
We have one from Rhonda.
Yes.
Hey, yes, I have a couple of questions. I have one for Jen. Jen, are the purchase eligibility, does it go back to the March 3rd of 21 date like state fiscal recovery, or is it, what is the date for eligible purchases for, you know, supplies, construction, that sort of thing?
Good
So
question.
based
You can
on
take it, Jessica.
this, so based on this program, as specified in the notice of funding opportunity, it will be based on the date that terms and conditions are executed by the awardee. So
Okay.
that will be different from state fiscal recovery funds. It will be moving forward from the execution of terms and conditions.
Okay. And then for the affordable price, the affordable plan price, is there a designated amount that is required for it to be considered affordable, or?
No, so that will be up to the provider to provide that information in their application, along with a description as to why they believe that that is the most reasonable, affordable option based on that community engagement component that I discussed previously. So there is not a dollar amount that will be considered affordable, but obviously, the lower the dollar amount of that, it certainly will score better. But obviously a description and a rationale behind how they got to that number with that community, I think would be important as well.
Okay, and then last question, sorry. On the map refresh after the verifications, are you going to submit a new map that will show the eligible projects, or are you just going to notify the people that submitted a data request for those areas that they're no longer eligible?
So what we will do, we'll do both. So there will be a final map that will replace the preliminary map on OPB's website, just to provide clarification. Just for example of, the metrics of how the state determined the eligibility were if a county was more than 20% unserved, or if it had more than 2,500 unserved locations. However, for example, if a verification comes in and shows that there are now, if a county was right at 2,500 and a verification that comes in and shows that there's 1,000 additional locations that are served that the state is now aware of, that particular county and project area will not be eligible based on the criteria. And so there will be a final list of project areas that will be published on OPB's website. And what we will do, though, is for anybody that's requested location level information, we will update them with those new files to make sure that if any locations are removed, they're still not designing their application around the initial data set that they received.
Okay, thank you all so much.
Like Dustin has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Just to be clear, a couple things. ACP participation equals affordability.
No, so the program requires applicants to participate in ACP,
Okay.
but Treasury also encourages providers essentially provide one low-cost option. Ultimately, Treasury obviously, would like to see, and a number of providers have come out nationally that low-cost option is $30. So essentially that the ACP subsidy would make that free for eligible applicants for ACP. But again, like we previously mentioned, there is not a dollar amount or threshold that the state has identified as affordable, just because we feel that, and based on Treasury guidance, we feel that talking with those communities and working with the providers is the important way to establish that, just because we know some providers can get to that $30 mark, and we also know that it's not feasible for other providers to be able to get to that $30 mark.
Okay, thank you.
And so that's where that explanation of just, I think, would be important to say of, that, again, the lower the better, but the explanation as to why this is the number that is really the most feasible.
Gotcha. Okay. And then I think I heard you say that the project areas will be full counties.
No. In some cases, it could be very close to all of the number of unserved locations within a county. But the state has worked with an engineering firm to do cost modeling to identify the eligible project locations within that. And so it, for the most part, will be almost all of the locations within the county, but for the extreme high cost locations, those potentially have been removed from the project area to potentially address in future programs.
Okay. Okay.
Quick clarification on that, Josh here with GTA. So there can be no confusion. So what's going to be required of applicants is that they submit proposals for all of the project area. The entirety of a project area cannot be parts of that, but the project area itself might not be an entire county. So you have to submit completely under the for all locations in the project area as described by the state. And then when it comes to those project areas, as the state has drawn them, they might not be entire counties themselves with all unserved locations, but they're very, very close.
Okay.
Yes, thanks.
But
Josh.
and that will be established by the state.
Yes.
Okay.
So is that basically all locations within the county that are showing in blue? Does that make sense? So like, is it, if you request a data set for that county, is it all of the locations that are in blue? Is that basically what the project area is?
Yes.
Okay.
Hey,
Steven?
Jessica. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I got a question. So, in the eligible applicant section, it says someone who builds broadband networks or operates broadband networks. So what does that do with the ACP if you only build a network and you don't operate it? You automatically lose those points, or does it pass on to the carrier that operates your network?
So the goal, and if we need to amend that, we certainly can, but so that really is coming directly from Treasury language. The goal of the eligible applicant is who is going to own the network in the end. That is who needs to be applying for this grant. So whether that's an ISP, whether that's an EMC or a municipal utility, the eligible applicants are going to be the end owner of the network.
Okay. But common times, they're not the service provider.
And so like, for example, like for EMCs, for example, obviously sometimes they are not the service provider, but they still do own the network. And so obviously it's, and we can potentially talk offline about this as well, but it's going to be whoever owns the network in the end that should be eligible to apply.
Okay. Okay.
And that's mainly structured around all of the guidance and conversations that we've had with Treasury, just because of transferring assets and everything that we've worked through based on state fiscal recovery funds. The grant award needs to be made to the owner of the network.
Okay.
And if they have a separate ISP that lights that, that's fine. It needs to be the owner of the network submitting the application.
Perfect.
And Stephen, just to add on to that, in the case of someone who's just building the network, but is not necessarily the provider, and they're submitting that application, we would want to see in that application that that a provider has been designated, that they are describing in that who is actually going to be working with them on this project, that they are going to be the one participating in ACP, that they will be the one that is providing that affordable option potentially. We actually had this happen under the first round of ARPA a couple times, where we had applications that were submitted by someone who was going to build a network, but they had no provider. And that made it very difficult for us to evaluate because of the fact that we didn't know who we didn't know which provider was going to be providing the service. We didn't know what sorts of speeds. We didn't know what sorts of costs and subscription costs that they were going to ask for. So we would just ask, in a case like this, probably for a more competitive application, you need to make sure and have a carrier or provider partner as part of that project that you then describe throughout your application.
No,
Thanks,
that
Josh.
makes,
And just
that makes perfect sense.
And just to piggyback off of that, of what Josh said, I think that weaves well into Mike's question about if an entity has not previously provided retail broadband service, but has a long history of providing complex services to customers like an EMC or electric co-op, will they be eligible for this program? Yes. So essentially, just like Josh said, you'll be eligible to apply for this, but obviously we'll need all of the detailed information as to who the ISP that you're working with is going to be and who will end up obviously lighting the network. It is clear in the notice of funding opportunity that internet service providers, electric co-ops, and utilities are eligible to apply for this.
Thank you.
Thanks. Looks like Tom McCabe has a question.
Thank you, Jessica. Can you maybe give a little bit more background or understanding in terms of what you see as a partnership arrangement? Say two companies were to go ahead and, one has one portion of a county, and they provide a joint bid, but each company is going to own that portion of the network. Would they handle all of the, funding requests and procurement, all those types of things separately, or does it have to go under one entity that they have to form?
So I will have Jonna jump in here if she disagrees or wants to add anything to this. But so our vision of this is that essentially that the state would have completely separate agreements. If you have two providers covering a particular area, that we would have separate agreements with those providers, and that they would just procure things independently. But if there is a situation though that an entity exists where they do want to procure all of that together, that is certainly something that we can talk about offline. But we generally do envision for those partnerships that would probably be done separately, and the state would have separate terms and conditions with each of the providers on that. However, again, if there's a unique situation, we certainly can talk about that offline.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I think Stephen
Hey,
Milner's
Steve, I think you're on
talking.
mute.
Sorry, I was just talking over here. Something I just wanted to clarify, I think that I heard you mention earlier. So you wouldn't be able to order material to use on the project until after you sign your terms and conditions. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the project complete date is the end of 26, right? Yes. Okay, so I'm just trying to think of when we get back to timelines here. That's going to be ambitious, on some of these projects. Just kind of thinking that through.
And the goal of this obviously is, assuming that we get approved by Treasury, the other thing is we want to be very mindful of the timelines of how long these builds are going to take. And so that's the other reason why we are looking to have a very aggressive review window. And so that way we can hopefully make award announcements this fall in order to try to address some of those issues to go ahead and get these projects moving so that they can meet those December 31st, 2026 completion date.
Yeah, I guess to carry that forward, Jessica, can you talk through the kind of the definition of operational? I guess that, there's some requirements that at least operations have to begin by the end of the performance window, and then all of the money has to be drawn down by the end of December. So kind of how those could possibly square up.
Yeah, so that language in the notice of funding opportunity came directly from Treasury guidance, where essentially they say that essentially it has to be, and let me pull up the specific language, but essentially it has to be operational for its intended use. And so at that point, I mean, it has to essentially be completed that you are lighting customers.
Does that mean every customer?
Let us review that, and we can talk offline, or we can put an
Yeah.
addendum on OPB's website. But I believe, when they're talking about substantial completion, that does need to be that the network is essentially done.
Okay.
Kind of the way I would see it would be to receive your final reimbursement from the grant, completely closing out the entire thing. I don't think that the state or would wish to close out a grant agreement and make that final reimbursement to whoever's the award winner before the project is complete. So by looking at it that way, it almost kind of ties the two together. But like Jessica said, I mean, there might be some thinking on that can be done.
Yeah.
And that's where, also maybe the idea of partnering in particular project areas makes sense, so that, if a project area is one of our larger project areas, perhaps a partnership makes sense in that, so that, you've got two partners coming in, or two or more partners coming in and handling ultimately a smaller area to make the timeline potentially more feasible. That December 31st, 2026 deadline is set by the legislation. And so at this point, the state obviously doesn't have any flexibility on that. And so that's also where, it might be an interesting idea to kind of get creative with those partnerships if some of the timelines are not looking feasible to complete this project area by 2026, by the end of 2026.
Yeah. In a perfect world, that is probably fine. But in the current environment we find ourselves in, there's obviously some concern about supply and things of that nature. So
Sure.
Thank you.
Hey, thank goodness George is at least running our program now instead of, a year or two down the road.
Yeah, no, appreciate the urgency. I do.
Okay, Bobby Gilbert.
Thanks, Jessica. I just had a question regarding, I believe you had mentioned that address level data would be available for the verification process, and wondered, I've submitted the request, just wondered when we might expect that information back to get that process started.
Sure. So Carl Vinson usually has a 1 to 2 day turnaround on that. So based on when you submitted your request, I would expect that would be sent today, but I would expect 1 to 2 days on that.
Okay, thank you.
Tom?
One other question, Jessica. When I'm viewing the maps, the current maps today, and I'm looking at the project areas, the preliminary project areas, and if I see a lot of sites on the map or locations on the map that were unserved locations on the availability map, those are probably referring to those high cost locations.
That's a possibility. The other thing that I will say is timelines of things are never perfect, and data is obviously constantly evolving. And so whenever we receive additional updates, that's what that blue layer is, the post deadline submissions on the website. Of as we continuously receive information from providers, we try to factor that in. However, we had to essentially put our cutoff of July 1 when we developed these project areas. And so I think it's important to note I think it's kind of a two-pronged question there of, I think it's important to note that if we have received information potentially after July 1, it could be showing on the availability map, excuse me, but might not be factored into the planning numbers for this process. But if you are seeing unserved locations that are outside of the eligibility areas, those potentially would have been the areas removed during the engineering process.
Okay. And what we receive from Carl Vinson will have those stripped out, right?
Yes, only the eligible locations that you will receive from Carl Vinson will be within the data set.
Okay. Thank you.
Jessica, just a quick follow-up to Dustin's question. You have two partnerships. One company finishes the project by the deadline, the other party does not. There's no liability that would fall to the company that's finished all of their work and are operational.
I'm not an attorney, so I don't want to give you a final answer on that, but so that's why I would generally say, excuse me, that I think that would be really the rationale as to why the state would have separate terms and conditions with each of the provider partners. So that way the provider that finished, that completed all of the project and met all the milestones, obviously would have the ability to be fully reimbursed by the state. And then at that point, that way they would not have issues for the fact that their provider partner did not execute the work that needed to be done based on the terms and conditions with the state. And so that's why it probably would be a better scenario to do individual agreements with the provider partners for each location. I would see that obviously if an entity is formed, that singular entity is the one that ends up signing terms and conditions with the state for the total project, then again, obviously we would need a legal opinion, but I do think that there would be the possibility that ultimately that the partners could potentially be liable. But again, I'm not an attorney, so I don't want to give legal advice. But I do think it would be a cleaner path for the state to just have separate terms and conditions with each of the partners, just so that does not become an issue.
Yeah, we would certainly want to have separate terms and conditions in any partnership. I just want to make sure that just in case we do have that arrangement, there's no legal ramification to us if the other individual did not meet its obligations.
And we certainly can talk with our attorneys about that, but I think as long as we have separate terms and conditions, hopefully we should be fine.
That would probably be important if you could get that clarified, because otherwise the two parties are going to need to engage in a lot of legal work to settle liability before they could ever move forward. Thank you.
And essentially what we would look to do is your terms and conditions with the state would only be based on the part of the project area that you would be serving. And so again, we don't foresee, as long as there's separate terms and conditions, that would be an issue, but we certainly can follow up with you on that.
Thank you.
Stephen?
Hey, Jessica, can you hear me?
Yes.
The Georgia broadband availability map, is the percent unserved currently shown when you click on a county? Is it already subtracting out those locations that are going to be served under an RDOF grant?
I don't believe so. I believe that, so when we looked at the data behind the scenes, what we did is we had Carl Vinson pull, based on the map refresh, how many unserved locations are within a community, but then at that point back out any state or federal funding commitment, whether that was ARPA, RDOF, Reconnect, the broadband program with NTIA. And so let me pull that up quickly and just confirm that for you. But again, that's where it's also important to note that we received so many data submissions from providers for the broadband availability map. Carl Vinson, and that's why it's so important that everybody submits on time, because it does take Carl Vinson a lot of time to do the analysis for the particular counties and shading census blocks. And so that's why they've had to get creative this year with our new blue layer for late submissions. But they're not able, based on those submissions, they're not able to factor in any late submissions into the actual analysis. So like if you click on a county and you look at the number of unserved, served, and percent unserved, that will not include late submissions. And so the current map, if you click on it, I'm just doing a quick check of it. I believe that that number does not include RDOF or ARPA funding commitments. But that obviously you can turn on the layer within the map to see where obviously those funding commitments are on the shading in green with those census blocks.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Well, if there aren't any other questions, what I will do is let me go ahead and share my screen again just to make sure that you have my contact information and Jana's contact information. Can y'all see the PowerPoint? Okay,
Yes.
perfect. So so that is my email address and Jana's email address. Please reach out to us if you have any specific individual questions. We certainly want to be a good resource to you, and we will post the recording of this workshop on OPB's website, along with the PowerPoint slides. However, obviously, a significant portion of the information contained within the PowerPoint is also within the notice of funding opportunity. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and let us know. We will follow up with our attorneys on that one point about partnerships and make that clear online. But with that, just want to give everybody one more opportunity if there's any other questions. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and end the session and give everybody about 10 minutes back this morning. All righty. Well, thank you. I appreciate everybody's time. And if you need anything, just reach out to us.
Thank you,
so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica.